So one day last week, I was getting ready to do the readings for the day that we normally do together as a family. And I noticed that the first reading was from Acts chapter 4, in which it says that there were no needy among them. This is in the early church, because people would sell all their possessions, give it to the apostles, and then it would be distributed to each according to their need. And as soon as I read that, I thought, okay, great. Twitter is going to be awash with people trying to shoehorn Christianity and communism together. So just get ready for that. And the reason for that is because Karl Marx coined a phrase that has become something of a communist mantra that sounds a lot like the phrasing in that verse in Acts chapter 4. It goes, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And sure enough, I saw a very self-satisfied tweet from somebody who clearly had communist sympathies, who said something like, all of those capitalist Christians must be trembling as they try to justify their disdain for communism after reading something that is so clearly communist. Now, I'm not an expert on communism or even Christianity for that matter, but I know enough about both to know that whatever similarities you might be able to detect between the two at a high level, when you get down to the fundamentals of each, you'll find that there are irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable differences would be like that concept that causes all those inseparable celebrity couples, those great romances, to fall apart, so you know that it's a serious difference. Even the fact that some Christians call themselves communist Christians, that kind of underlines the point for me. If they are the same thing, then you shouldn't have to qualify your Christianity. If Christianity simply taught communism as part of its social teaching, then simply describing yourself as Christian would capture that vision as a whole. To try to act as if those things are the same thing simply because of some similarity that you've been able to detect is critically insufficient. On that ground, you could pretty much turn Christianity or the Christian faith into anything you like. You could say something as ridiculous as, well, you know, those Christians, they lived in community. You know who else lives in community? Wolves. They're pretty much a wolf pack. It's the same thing. And before you say, that's stupid, I think that, there's a lot of branding potential in this whole wolf pack association. I think it would be worth it for the church to get some of our top people to start to look into this. Now, obviously, that's a bit of tongue-in-cheek hyperbolicitization. But it does go to show if you're going to try to conflate Christianity with communism, you have to ignore some flagrant contradictions between the two to make it work. So I want to take some time to itemize some of the essential points in Marxist theory that are irreconcilable with the church and with scriptural teaching. So let's start with what Karl Marx said is basically the summation of communism. In chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, he says, the theory of communism may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Now, I know that Marx makes a distinction between what he calls private property and personal property, indicating that anything that has a social dimension to it, that's what he means by private property, and that can't be considered private property because of its social aspect. But if you have any familiarity with the Bible or with Scripture, you still have to know that this still goes way too far. In that very same reading of the Acts of the Apostles that so many communist Christians think affirms their identity, it says that from time to time, when there was need, that some of the disciples who own possessions or especially land, they would go and sell that and then give the proceeds to the church in which it would get distributed. But in communism, you can't sell land or private property because no such thing exists. But instead, Scripture records that it does exist and that the disciples voluntarily forfeited it, which is quite different from having it forcibly confiscated by either the state or the proletariat class. And of course, wealth, inheritance, land, these are all concepts recognized in Scripture as valid and susceptible to private ownership. We see this especially in the books of Numbers and Leviticus, which are about establishing the chosen people and the way that they are to arrange themselves economically and politically. Pope St. John Paul II, in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, further explains how this socialist teaching is incompatible with the Christian view. He says, a person who is deprived of something he can call his own, and of the possibility of earning a living through his own initiative, comes to depend on the social machine and those who control it. This makes it much more difficult for him to recognize his dignity as a person and hinders progress towards the building up of an authentic human community. Next, something that is essential, or at least strongly encouraged within Marx's theory, is violent revolution. And with hindsight in view, and for anyone with any level of historical literacy, this should come as no surprise, because everywhere there have been attempts by people to earnestly apply Marx's theories, there have been massive death tolls in initial revolutionary outbursts, and then in attempts to maintain what is obviously an untenable political system through more violence and oppression. Marx says this in his manifesto again: the immediate aim of the communists is the formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. He also argues that theories once adopted by the masses can be considered a material force and should therefore be met with material force. In other words, violence against others for the spread of their beliefs is justified. Now, some Marxist theorists dispute that Marx necessarily promoted violence, because it's obviously a bad look that some people might want to disassociate themselves from. But how else do you account for the overthrow of society, especially if some people don't want it to be overthrown, which there will inevitably be some of these kinds of sticklers. I would consider myself among them. Well, you have to force them to play along, to get with the program. Ultimately, that's going to require a certain measure of violence. In church teaching, use of force can be justified, but only if it meets certain criteria. For example, it should be in self-defense. The need to overthrow political or economic systems is not, however, found among those criteria or in anything remotely close to the teachings of Jesus. The next major incompatibility, and I would argue is the sharpest contrast between Christianity and communism, is the assertion by Marx that all human endeavor, all history, all struggle arises because of economic necessity. Everything we do is motivated by our economic and material welfare. He calls this historical materialism. And because economic need is all that matters, all of our attention should be directed towards systematically solving that. And of course, once we do, then all of our other problems will dissolve along with it. G.K. Chesterton, in his masterpiece, The Everlasting Man, makes some points that I think are fatal to this theory of history. He says, "But there is a deeper fallacy besides this obvious fact, that men need not live for food merely because they cannot live without food. The truth is that the thing most present to the mind of man is not the economic machinery necessary to his existence, but rather that existence itself, the world which he sees when he wakes every morning, and the nature of his general position in it. There is something that is nearer to him than livelihood, and that is life. For once that he remembers exactly what work produces his wages and exactly what wages produce his meals, he reflects 10 times that it is a fine day, or it is a queer world, or wonders whether life is worth living, or wonders whether marriage is a failure, or is pleased and puzzled with his own children, or remembers his own youth, or in any such fashion vaguely reviews the mysterious lot of man." Chesterton's point is that the moment we are materially satisfied is the moment we become restless and anxious about an endless myriad of thoughts that relate to our existence and ontology rather than economics. We begin to speculate about the purpose of our lives, the state of our souls, the strangeness of being, our relationships, our need for beauty, and on and on. Chesterton goes on to ask what it is that motivates a man to be willing to die for his country, which of course countless men have been willing to do. It can't be said that this is for his own economic interests, because of course he won't be alive to actually enjoy them. Or what about the countless examples of self-sacrifice and the stories that we tell which inspire our imagination and our resolution to be more generous ourselves? I think that the appeal of such narratives connects to something within our own consciences which has nothing to do with our own material necessity. John Paul II again summarizes the problem with materialist thinking in this way when he says, "The fundamental error of socialism is anthropological in nature. Socialism considers the individual person simply as an element, a molecule within the social organism, so that the good of the individual is completely subordinated to the functioning of the socio-economic mechanism. Socialism likewise maintains that the good of the individual can be realized without reference to his free choice, to the unique and exclusive responsibility which he exercises in the face of good or evil. Man is thus reduced to a series of social relationships, and the concept of the person as the autonomous subject of moral decisions disappears. Now, if this serious incompatibility isn't already obvious, by insisting that all of our needs and all of our motivations can be summarized in economic terms, Marx is highlighting the fact that communism is fundamentally atheistic. It doesn't have time or concern for anything that transcends, that goes beyond the material facts, or for any thought of human beings as being anything more than mere animals who have to find shelter and food. And again, if we just add a little more context from that passage in Acts chapter 4 again, which so many communist Christians think affirms their identity, it says that the reason that nobody went without according to their need was because God's grace was working so powerfully in them as a community. If you seek God and his kingdom first, which is something that Marx says is just a distraction and an opium of the people, you will be inspired and equipped to show concern for your fellow man, when nothing in the economic facts, which again is the only thing that Marx says we should be looking at to solve our problems, compels us to do so, which is why communism always fails. It can't account why anybody should be concerned with their neighbor based on the material facts. The facts don't tell us what we ought to do. At best, they only tell me what I want to do, and that's only if I look at the very peculiar fact which is internal to myself and my desires, which isn't observable. What I ought to do, namely share with my neighbor, is a truth that transcends the facts. And unless you can account for that transcendence in something like an inspiration or a revelation from God who compels you to do what is right, then there is very little reason to make those kinds of sacrifices. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.